Good evening, everyone. My name is Joel Samuels, and I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina. It's my distinct honor to welcome each and every one of you here tonight. The Solomon-Tenenbaum Lecture is a signal event in the annual series of events we hold in our college, in which we engage our community, so many of you, in the university and across Columbia, and indeed across the entire state. As a university, we are committed to conducting cutting-edge research, producing and sharing knowledge, and educating our citizens, particularly our young citizens, our students, teaching them critical skills as they embark on their professional careers. Civic-minded benefactors are an essential component in this enterprise. They are people of generous spirit, imbued with an intellectual curiosity and the inspiration to give back to the community. Without them, our mission and our responsibility as a major flagship university would be substantially more difficult to realize. The University of South Carolina and the College of Arts and Sciences are in the enviable position of having two such persons who have supported this particular lecture and many others across our community. Tonight, we honor the Solomon and Tenenbaum families who have given generously and tirelessly to support what is now an enduring institution at our university, our city, and our state. This lecture embodies the very best of our benefactors. It is guided by the desire to connect town and gown, to disseminate knowledge, and to reflect and actively promote the notion that the life of the mind matters to us all. In times like these, in times across our country, these are matters we must be thinking about, reflecting on the past, reflecting on the present, and thinking about what this all means for our futures. So I'd like to take a moment to thank Samuel and Inez Tenenbaum. Samuel is with us tonight for their generosity. Along with Melvin and Judith Solomon, who established the Solomon-Tenenbaum Lectureship in Jewish Studies in 1990 in memory of Samuel's father, Meyer Warren Tenenbaum, and his mother, LaBelle Florence Tenenbaum. For the past 30 years, this endowed lectureship has brought high-profile figures to our university campus. As a result, we've been fortunate to learn valuable lessons from speakers who shared with us their expertise, insights, and experience. Who can forget Nobel Peace Prize winner and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, who left an indelible imprint on our campus, or Pulitzer Prize winner Thomas Friedman, as well as renowned New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine, who filled this room much as it is filled tonight, just last year. All of them provided intellectual engagement and food for thought. Thank you, Samuel and Inez, for your vision and commitment to making this possible. Tonight's topic, can we really learn from the past? The Holocaust, history, and the problem of memory is timely on many levels. 2 weeks ago, on January 27th, we commemorated the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, one of Nazi Germany's 6 extermination camps on Polish soil. Soviet soldiers encountered indescribable scenes as they passed through the gates, witnessing unprecedented levels of human cruelty. What have we learned since then? What role does memory play in how we relate to history and that of a shared past? We, as institutions of higher learning, take an active role in better understanding cause and effect, historical context, effective teaching, and disseminating knowledge to the public, to students, as well as to engage audiences like yourselves. The College of Arts and Sciences takes a leading role in this effort by organizing events like this that open up important conversation on these questions, and by incorporating into its curriculum courses that educate our students about the complexities of our past and present. Our Jewish Studies program, for instance, offers courses on the history of the Holocaust, which fills at capacity every year, Holocaust film and literature, and the history and legacy of Anne Frank, to name just a few. I want to thank our university's president, Dr. Michael Amaritis, and First Lady Arrow, for being here tonight, for their continued engagement with and support of both the college and the Jewish Studies program. I'd also like to acknowledge 2 previous College of Arts and Sciences deans, which I always like to do when they're here, my colleagues Marianne Fitzpatrick and Lacey Ford, and Marianne indeed was the dean who established the Jewish Studies program during her deanship. There are so many others I could thank, so I'm not going to spend my night introducing each and every one of you, but I want to say that each of you who's here with us tonight plays an important role in the life of our college, of our university. Now it's my pleasure to turn over the program to Dr. Saskia Conen-Steiner, the director of the Jewish Studies program here at USC, to introduce tonight's speaker, Daniel Mendelsohn. Saskia.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to see so many of you here tonight. Our annual Solomon-Tenenbaum Lecture always draws crowds, and you delivered again tonight by filling almost every seat in this auditorium, I think. I should maybe put on my glasses, actually. I can see my notes. As Dean Samuel said, my name is Saskia Coenen-Steiner. I'm a professor of modern Jewish history here at USC and director of the Jewish Studies program. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces in the audience. I see faculty and friends, some of my students, extra credit tonight, and members of the wider Columbia community. Over the years, the Solomon-Tenenbaum Lectureship has become an institution on our campus. Inaugurated in 1990, it has grown into a multi-day affair where speakers visit classes, attend faculty roundtables, take tours, and meet with engaged groups and federations off campus. And we couldn't organize all this without significant support, and so I'd like to say a few thank yous to people who've worked tirelessly behind the scenes, making sure that even the smallest details are taken care of. Megan Plott, Morgan Watson, and Hannah Tromble from the College of Arts and Sciences External Relations Office are masterminds. Even when newborn babies and snow and Arctic temperatures come along and even close down our university campus, this team is unfazed, ready to handle it all without so much as blinking. So thank you for your organizational expertise, your patience and grace. And Brian Gentry, the Director of Communications, always helps us get out the word, and he does it very well, I would say. So thank you for that. Moss Blackman, too, deserves recognition for his labor, as do other members of the Solomon-Tenenbaum Committee. Andrew Burns, Agnes Mueller, and Samuel Tenenbaum, without whom we wouldn't have this lecture every February. So thank you for your commitment and your time. I saw many of you, as Dean Samuels already talked about, 2 weeks ago on January 27th during the 80th commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz. The South Carolina Council on the Holocaust organized an impressive program that drew attention to a historical event that caused such ruptures, changing our understanding of the human capacity for pain. As Red Army soldiers entered Auschwitz in January of 1945, they witnessed scenes of death and depravity that defied the imagination. How to explain, as one Dutch Jewish diarist wrote during the war, how to explain Auschwitz to the world? How to be what she called the ears and eyes of a piece of Jewish history? Some people may argue that we can't fully or really understand the Holocaust, that it's beyond our comprehension. And if that were true, then the classes that we teach in our schools and our university, the books we write, the research we do, would be pointless. And as a historian, I would argue that we do know what happened, why it happened, what Nazi violence entailed, even if there are still pieces of the puzzle missing. Any complex historical moment and event can be unpacked to study cause and effect. We can understand the Holocaust by conventional historical means and scholarly analysis. This is not to say that the Holocaust doesn't have any larger meanings, about the meaning, about the role of God or philosophy, for instance, but those are not historical questions. In one of his most important monographs, our speaker tonight attempted to find some of these missing puzzle pieces and restore the identities of family members vanished under Nazi rule. The Lost, a search for 6 million, awarded the National Books Critics Circle Award, the National Jewish Book Award, as well as the Prix Médicis in France, traces the fate of Jewish family members in Eastern Europe. Combining memoir, detective work, and scholarship, he explores the nature of time and memory, of family and history, connecting Miami Beach and New York City to Poland, Israel, even Sydney, Australia. An international bestseller, The Lost is a remarkable book, perhaps most important in rescuing lost family, from the anonymity of mass graves, restoring their identity, and voices in powerful ways. His book reminded me of Joseph Chaim Yerushalmi's revered book, Zachor, referring to the Hebrew word and injunction to remember. Yerushalmi, who maintained that, quote, memory is always problematic, studied the relationship between the arc of traditional Jewish collective memory and that of modern critical history. Zachor explained how Jews have historically related to their past, contrasting traditional Jewish memory sustained through rituals, storytelling, religious texts, with that of modern historical and objective analysis. Where these two arcs meet, collective memory and history, and what we ultimately do with it, will be food for thought tonight. And how better to tackle this than with a classicist whose lens and interpretations are informed by ancient text, by the long view, by classical works of literature that suggest there's a type of knowledge that can only be gained with the experience of time and perhaps with critical distance. I can think of a time when the question, can we really learn from our past, or from the past, has been more pressing than it is right now. A time when Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu faces accusations of war crimes and a warrant for his arrest from the International Criminal Court. A time when an Episcopal bishop pleading for compassion and empathy during a church service attended by our current president is met with scorn, followed by a GOP congressman stating publicly that she should be, quote, added to the deportation list. A time when Jewish soccer fans are harassed in Amsterdam after an international match, marking what the Dutch mayor called, quote, the darkest night in the city's history since World War II. And a time when the moving words of a South Carolina rabbi at the Auschwitz commemoration are censored and erased because they are deemed too political. If we are not allowed to connect past with present, if we can't acknowledge that everything is political, have we really learned anything from our past at all? Memory, after all, as James Young explained in his well-known book, The Texture of Memory, cannot be divorced from the actions taken in its behalf, and that memory, without consequence, contains the seeds of its own destruction. If we leave our past unexplored, he argued, and remain unchanged by the recollective act, we might not have remembered at all. So the contours of memory are colored by the temper of our time, by who is doing the remembering, toward what end, and the ideological landscape in which these debates occur. And I cannot wait how our speaker's reflection on the complexities of memory will add to this conversation. Daniel Mendelsohn is an acclaimed American author, critic, essayist, translator, and public intellectual. Having received degrees in classics from the University of Virginia and Princeton, he moved to New York to write full-time, and for the past 30 years has been a regular contributor to The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, and the New York Review of Books. And in 2019, he was named editor-at-large of this premier literary magazine. Mendelsohn is the Charles Randlett Flint Professor of Humanities at Bard College and the author of 11 books, including The Elusive Embrace in 1999, An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, named Best Book of the Year in 2017, a scholarly study of Greek tragedy entitled Gender and the City in Euripides. I knew I was going to mess that word, Euripides' political plays, and Three Rings, A Tale of Exile, Narrative, and Fate, published in 2020, named Kirkus Best Book of the Year and Best Foreign Book of the Year in France. And his new translation of Homer's The Odyssey will be hot off the press this April, published by the University of Chicago Press. Our speaker has many honors, received many honors, a Guggenheim, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Harry Purcell Prize, Princeton University's James Madison Medal, just to name a few. And in 2022, he was made a Knight of the Order of Arts and Letters by the Republic of France and received the Premio Malaparte, Italy's highest honor for foreign writers. Tonight, he will deliver a talk entitled, Can We Really Learn from the Past? The Holocaust, History, and the Problem of Memory. After his presentation, he will be joined by Dean Samuels, who will engage with him in conversation, and there will be an opportunity for you all to ask questions. And there's a note card in front of you And please write your questions down, and then student ambassadors will collect those, and we will make sure that some of your questions will be considered as well. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Mendelsohn.
Thank you. Good evening. Before I begin, I want to say that although I am a Yankee, I am not a stranger to Southern hospitality. I went to the University of Virginia and had many friends from South Carolina there, and so I've been visiting this state since the late 1970s. And my older son actually went to Furman, so I know upstate quite well. Two of my dearest friends have moved to Charleston, and so I've been now having the pleasure of seeing Charleston, and I'm very happy to be welcomed for my first visit to Columbia, and I just want to thank everyone for the wonderful and warm welcome that I've received since I arrived here yesterday evening and was immediately caught up in the mad social swirl of Columbia. And I want to thank President and Mrs. Amiridis. Some of you know that one of the hats I wear is as a translator of modern Greek poetry, and so I was very happy to be chatting with them earlier. It made me feel like I had a little Greek hospitality, which is always nice. Saskia and the members of the Jewish Studies program have been incredibly warm and welcoming. Moss, and of course Samuel-Tenenbaum, with whom I had a lovely dinner last night. So it's been really wonderful to come here, and I'm very honored and pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you about this question of, can we really learn from the past, the Holocaust, history, and the problems of memory? And so that is what I will now begin. So as not to keep you in suspense, I'm going to start by answering the question raised in the title of my remarks tonight. And the answer is, nah. Can we learn from history? Sometimes. Do we learn from history? Rarely. But to me, the more interesting question is, what do we mean by history when we ask whether we can learn from it? How, after all, do we get the history of an event from which we might learn something? All histories, as we know, derive in one way or another from memories of a given event. But as we know, memory is at best flawed, problematic. What then is the relationship of memory to history? To get at these questions this evening, I'd like to share with you some experiences I've had with history and memory while researching and writing the book that Saskia was just describing to you, The Lost, which is a book about my search to find out about the lives and the deaths of 6 of my family members, ordinary Jews who perished during the German occupation of a small Polish town called Bolechov during World War II, a book that eventually took me to a dozen countries on 4 continents as I tracked down the few remaining people who had known my family in the hopes of raiding their memories for whatever scraps of information might still exist. 20 years ago, when I was in the middle of researching this book, I got what looked like a lucky break. At the time, I desperately needed one. I was, to be honest, barely qualified for the immense job that I had taken on. I was a cultural critic and a book reviewer, not an investigative reporter. And even worse, I really knew very little at the time about the enormous subject that I had begun writing about. I want to emphasize from the start of my remarks this evening that I wrote my book not as a scholar of the Holocaust, or even as an amateur enthusiast of Jewish history or Jewish life, but as a private person writing about private family matters. As a child, I was interested in tracing my family tree. an interest that had much to do with the close relationship I had with my grandfather, my mother's father, an Eastern European immigrant who liked in later life to reminisce colorfully about his old town. And at a certain point, it became clear to me that this family tree had been truncated, that certain limbs of that tree had not withered away, as is usually the case with family trees, but had been cut off violently. At the beginning of 2001, I decided to try to find out what had become of those missing limbs, an impulse that ended up leading me over the next 5 years to circle the globe, tracking down the few survivors from Bologov who had known my lost relatives, Uncle Shmuel, Aunt Esther, and their 4 lovely teenage daughters, Lorca, Fritka, Ruchela, and Bronya. I traveled from New York to Ukraine, where Bologov is now to be found, traveled to Poland and Lithuania and Latvia, to Australia and Denmark and Sweden, traveled twice to Israel, and finally, one last time to Bologov, tracking down anyone who might have had any contact with or knowledge of my 6 relatives, talking to these elderly people as I had once talked to my grandfather, listening to their memories and the stories of what happened between July of 1941, when the Germans arrived and there were 6,000 Jews in Bologov, and August of 1944, when the Soviets liberated the place and the 48 survivors emerged from the barns, bunkers, attics, cellars, and woods in which they had been hiding or hidden. But of course, by the time I embarked on my search, 60 years had passed, and the traces were few and far between. And so you can imagine how excited I was when, about halfway through the process of my researches, as I desperately tried to get some kind of information about what had actually happened to my Uncle Shmuel and his family, I got my lucky break. Someone mentioned to me that an online searchable database was now available through the website of Yad Vashem, the great Holocaust Museum Memorial in Jerusalem. After a few years of costly travel and many unsuccessful archival searches, I was thrilled to think that I could sit at my desk at home in New York City and find so much of what I had needed. And so I logged on and I went to Yad Vashem's central database of Shoah victims' names, and I began my search, entering my various parameters. The country, Poland, the town, Bologov, the surname that I had known so well since childhood, since it was my mother's name, Jaeger, Jager, with the 2 funny dots above the A. And indeed, 6 records turned up, records of 2 parents and their 4 children. My heart pounding, I began to read the record of Uncle Shmuel's oldest daughter, Lorca. It just so happened that I had been hearing conflicting stories from some of my Bologov survivors about just when this Lorca had run off to fight with a local partisan cell after the occupation began. Was it 1942? Was it 1943? And so I eagerly read the page about Lorca and learned the following. And now I'm just going to quote what the database gave me. Lorca Jaeger was born in Bolchov, Poland, in 1918 to Shmuel and Esther. She was single. Prior to World War II, she lived in Bolechów, Poland. During the war, she was in Bolechów, Poland. Lorca died in 1941 in Bolechów, Poland. This information is based on a page of testimony submitted on 22 May 1957 by her cousin, a Holocaust survivor. Now, if somebody other than myself, a real historian, say, not merely a distant relative with an itch to scratch, had been writing a book about the Holocaust in Eastern Poland at that moment, a book, let's say, about the fate of some other Jewish family of Bolechów, a family in whose story my relatives would have been peripheral characters, he or she would likely have been thrilled to come across this juicy documentary evidence and would no doubt have dutifully transcribed this information in his or her notes, which would then have become part of his or her book, part of the story of what had happened in Eastern Poland during World War II. And then, who knows? There might, even as we talk here this evening, be someone who's just now using that book as a reference for his or her own book about the Holocaust, a book with a wider or different angle, The Jews of Galicia, or Family Life Before the War, or whatever. And that book would be dutifully producing the facts about Lorca Jaeger and her family that this lucky researcher had come across in the central database of Shoah victims' names at Yad Vashem. And so it would go from book to book to book over who knows how many years, and we would probably be happy that at least those few facts about this one young woman, Lorca Jaeger, had been known, had been preserved in the mind of her anonymous relative, that Holocaust survivor who, on a May Day 68 years ago, took the time and effort to transcribe from her already dimming memory of a long-dead cousin whatever she remembered of that person, so that at least that too would not be obliterated from history, from the record of what had happened. The problem is that it was I who was writing this book and doing this research. I, the obsessive relative who had more urgent motivations for knowing things. And I can tell you that barely a single element of the entry in the Yad Vashem database is accurate. However little I knew by that point, I did know a few things. Because I am related to Lorca Jaeger, my second cousin, I happen to have her birth certificate, and so I know that Lorca was not born in 1918, but on May 21st, 1920. And I know further, because I was obsessed enough to go seek out the 12 remaining human beings on the face of the earth who actually knew Lorca, that she did not die in 1941, but was, according to a number of eyewitnesses, alive at least as late in the winter of 1942. And that in any case, she did not die in Balachov or Bolchov or Bolechov, all three spellings occur in the record, but she died and was killed in the heavily wooded Dolina forest outside of the town, fighting with the partisan group. And I might add that virtually all of the information provided at that point to the vast web-surfing public by the central database about Lorca's parents, Shmuel Jaeger, spelled Y-E-G-E-R, and Esther Jaeger, spelled J-E-G-E-R, and for the three daughters whom the database attributes to them, there were in fact four, Lorca Jaeger, J-E-J-G-E-R, Frida Jaeger, Y-E-G-E-R, and Racher Jaeger, is demonstrably wrong, from the spelling of their names, to the names of their parents, to the years in which they were born and died. Simply wrong. But unless, like me, you had a vested personal interest in the few facts that can still be known about these people, which is to say, unless you had a personal connection to Lorca and her story, you'd never know that the information about these 6 people that you were so happy to be able to find at Yad Vashem was also almost completely incorrect, and you'd never be the wiser. And you'd then include your erroneous findings in a book of your own, which would then become part of history, and no one else would be the wiser either. Why does this matter? Why do we care if a girl's name was Rachel and not Racher? That someone was born in 1921 and not 3 years earlier? I want to suggest that it matters, or rather it matters to me and possibly to you, precisely because we are in what I call a hinge moment in history, a moment in which we are still close enough to what happened, to the facts, the events, the truth, to care about the accuracy of small things and to be outraged when people get them wrong. Precisely because of that closeness, we today happen to be in a position to know the difference between the truth and the inaccuracies that otherwise might, in time, have come to pass for the truth? Would the history of the Holocaust be different in any significant way if 200 years from now people thought that a girl named Racher Jaeger had perished in the town of Bolachov rather than a girl whose name actually was Ruchele Jaeger? Would it be different if 200 years from now, or indeed 2000, someone were to read that a young woman who fought and was killed with the partisans was 21 rather than 18 years old when she died? At first glance, I think it's fair to say the answer would seem to be no. And yet, as we know, the whole history of an event is composed of smaller events, smaller details. And so that entry in the Yad Vashem database, accurate in the larger contours, of course, but inaccurate in almost every small detail, suggests some larger questions concerning the relationship of lived memory to recorded history, which is to say, how what happened became the story of what happened, and about the gap between those two and how it affects our ability to learn from history. First, however, I'd like to explore with you not the fact that such inaccuracies exist, so many of which are perhaps harmless, but the manner in which these inaccuracies come to be. In my experience in researching and writing my book, I came again and again against two kinds of error to which the historical record seems prone. One of these happens to do with memory, that is, with the subjectivity of the eyewitness accounts on which we depend for our knowledge of what happened. And the other has to do with what I'll call history, which is to say, with the subjectivity of the historians who write our histories. To illustrate what I mean by these, I want to tell you two stories, one from my childhood and one from the period when I was writing my book. I'll begin with a story about the unreliability of witnesses. The witness in question was my grandfather, a famous liar, or at least a famous storyteller, which may be the same thing. When I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s, I had this fabulous grandfather, dashing, funny, a man whom people would describe as a snappy dresser, whose argyle socks always matched his trousers, a man who was so lavish that he carried not one but two wallets, one in his trouser pocket for his money and his credit cards, and the other a mysteriously elongated thing whose contents we never saw, carefully placed in his breast pocket of whatever coat he happened to be wearing. A man who had come to this country as a youth of 18 in the year 1920 and made good. A man who spoke 7 languages and had 4 wives and 1 daughter, my mother. Oh, Abe, people would say, the stories he tells, the jokes. And indeed, the jokes were good. One crowd at Thanksgiving, he made poor Aunt Ida, his sister-in-law, pee in her pants before she could get away from the table. I preferred the stories, the tales of life in the old country, about the little individual challahs that his family's maid, Yoika, would bake each Friday for him and his 6 siblings, about his sister who died a week before her wedding, about the teenage Russian POWs from whom he learned Russian during World War I, while he, also a teenager, sat guarding them, well, playing cards with them. But the one story my grandfather would never speak of was about his older brother, about Uncle Shmuel, whose death we knew was the devastating tragedy of my grandfather's life. Uncle Shmuel, who had stayed behind in Poland after all the other siblings had emigrated to America, and who in time was, and this was the only thing Grandpa ever did say about him, killed by the Nazis. Even as a child, I was struck by the strange imbalance in our family narrative, the profusion of colorful stories about small things, but the absence of any story whatever about this great tragedy, which we knew even as children was part of a larger global tragedy. But on that one subject, my grandpa remained silent. And of this mysterious Schmiel, we knew virtually nothing except that he and the wife and the 4 beautiful daughters had all been killed by the Nazis. The only detail we ever heard in the years before my grandfather died in 1980, overheard, I should say, during a late-night conversation he had with my mother, on which I shamelessly listened in, was that Schmiel and his family had been hiding in some kind of castle, probably the manor house of the local Polish aristocrat who was the landlord of the town, and that the hiding place had been betrayed and they were all killed. Many years later, I would traipse around Ukraine looking for this fabulous castle. A Kessel, my grandfather had said, in the night of the one detail. I can still hear his accent. I knew it well, and because we were so close, I knew how to interpret it well, too. All those years in which he told so many stories except that one, we never really wondered why he had been silent. On the one hand, the horror of what had happened to his brother and sister-in-law and 4 nieces was too great to bear. On the other, there had never been any real story to tell. As I have said, the only detail to escape from the annihilation of Bolokov was that odd little factoid about the castle, and who knew what to make of that, really? So he was silent, and we never wondered. Then my grandfather died. Or I should say, in the interest of factual truth, since that is our concern this evening, he killed himself after a lifetime of what was then called nerves, of breakdowns, of mental anguish that no one had ever been able to get to the bottom of. He died on a Friday, the 13th in June of 1980, and my mother and I flew down to Miami to settle his affairs. And it was during the course of this mournful process that we finally got to see what was in that other wallet, the elongated one that didn't contain the cash and the credit cards, which tumbled off the desk that summer day into my lap as I packed up his papers. And what was in the wallet was this: a bunch of yellowed letters, all dated 1939, in a sloping German hand. Letters written by Uncle Schmiel to my grandfather, begging for help to get out of Europe as the whole world closed down around him, locking him in. Letters, the replies to which vanished 70 years ago, and whose contents could never be known, except, of course, for this, that whatever it was that my grandfather wrote back, whatever it was he did or did not do in response to his brother's pleas, made my grandfather feel so guilty that he carried his guilt with him for the rest of his life, carried it literally on his person in the wallet he always kept close to his heart. For the remainder of a life, he ended himself. So that was the reason why he had never said anything, and perhaps the reason he jumped in the pool that night in June of 1980. He was guilty. That's how little we knew all those years. That's how unreliable this great narrator was. The day I sat on the floor of his empty apartment in 1980 was the day I learned that the actors in crucial events, though they are important sources, always have agendas, can always be hiding things or protecting their own reputations or covering up their own sins. And so, from the very earliest years of my own inquiry into family history and eventually the Holocaust, there were problems with history and memory, problems posed by what we might call unreliable witnesses. Every witness, after all, has an agenda, whether unconscious or not. But when, as an adult, I resumed my search for Uncle Schmiel, I would run into another kind of memory problem, the one I call the problem of the unreliable narrator. This kind of problem I finally concretely understood during the last of my trips around the world in search of answers about Uncle Schmiel and his fate. In July of 2005, after 5 years of travel and interviews and research and study, I returned one last time to Bolokov for what I thought was going to be a few final photographs of the place for my book. It was during this trip that, quite unexpectedly, accidentally actually, I stumbled across the very house where my great-uncle Shmuel and one of the daughters, Fritka, had indeed been hiding, was in the very hiding place under the floor of the house, the hiding place from which they had been dragged and then shot in an orchard in back of the house. The house was no castle, I can tell you. But then it was only when I was actually there, actually standing in the horrible box-like subterranean hole where my great-uncle and his daughter spent an amount of time that nobody will ever know, that I, anxiously feeling around this tiny enclosure, suddenly realized that what my grandfather had said all those years ago was not castle, Kessel, as he pronounced it, his accent undiminished by 50 years of living in this country, but Kestel, the Yiddish word for box, which is indeed where they had been hiding, a hole in the ground 5 feet on a side that looked and felt exactly like being in a box. And so I had missed an essential truth about Shmuel's fate that I had been handed almost 40 years earlier, way before I started my research, but had been unable to understand, to make use of, because my ears were the ears of the American grandchild of a man who was a native Yiddish speaker, and my brain was the brain of a child who liked the romantic sound of castle as a hiding place, and who had thus grown up into a journalist who, 40 years in the future, would interview dozens of people trying to find out where the local castle had been, who had made this terrible mistake because historians are fallible too, because historians are as subject to their prejudices and their fantasies and wishful thinking as anyone else is, perpetrators, victims, neighbors, survivors, and witnesses. So there, in the 1960s and 2000s, there are a couple of stories about unreliable witnesses and unreliable narrators. When I started to write what I had always thought would be a fairly simple story, these recurring worries about reliability led me to worry further about this. What is the relationship of the flawed witness to the flawed historian, of lived life to history? Here I want to mention two things that one of the Bolokov survivors told me when I interviewed her in Sydney. Two things that, of all the memorable utterances I heard during my 5 years of research and writing my book, have stuck most deeply in my mind. This particular woman had been very reluctant to tell me her particular story. What happened to me happened to thousands of girls, she eventually said, staring at me stonily from behind the dark glasses she never took off. And when she finally relented, I began to ask her why she didn't want to talk to me. I don't want to tell you my story, she said, because if I tell you my story, it will become your story. This observation is, of course, true, and is, I think, the first thing we need to remember about history, even of a small personal history like the one I wrote. The story of the past that you get when you read a history is, in the end, the story that the historian decides to tell, decides will edify or entertain you after appropriating that story from the people to whom the story had actually happened, people who, as we know, might not be telling you everything. The second thing this woman in Sydney said that day was this: "You think," she sighed, "that you deserve to know all this because it's part of history." She sighed and was silent for a while, and then she went on, "But this wasn't history to me. It was my life. And while I live, it belongs to me." I want to end my remarks tonight with the question of narrative property that she raised that evening, of the difference between history as it happens to individual people with their specific memories and history as it is transmitted. As we know, as soon as someone like me writes down a story like hers, we are at the first step in a long process of both narrative and historical repossession. Repossession of the personal by the historical, of the facts by the story. This process itself inevitably endangers the facts, whatever those might be. Each successive retelling eliding some participant's point of view, eroding this or that small detail, until the whole story becomes vaguely but irredeemably altered, the way the true identity of the key word in that old children's game of telephone eventually becomes unrecognizable through too much repetition and too much handling. A good example of how this happened comes from another dark chapter in the history of the Jewish people, another period of unbearable horror that seemed at that point like the worst thing that had ever happened to us. The enslavement in the land of Egypt. I have no doubt that in the years following the Exodus, everyone was bearing witness, telling the amazing story of what had happened to them, sharing their memories, writing their memoirs. Moses, my camel, and our narrow escape through the Red Sea. But as we know, the thousands of individual stories that must have been part of that story eventually faded away, an erosion that would have offended the individuals to whom that remarkable event happened. But we don't care. The story we now tell, we tell once a year on Passover, and it takes barely an hour to tell it. The individuals have been eroded, the details have disappeared, and what remains is an instructive tale, the Haggadah. And to be sure, we feel that we learn from this annual ritual. We learn, or perhaps relearn, what it meant to be enslaved, and by extension, why no one should ever be enslaved again. The details have faded, but the lesson remains. That same process has in fact already begun with the Holocaust. As we know, there is now an annual Yom HaShoah, a day of remembrance. As we also know, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz has become an occasion of somber commemoration each year throughout the world. And yet, these laudable commemorations have necessarily already begun to erode the details, the individual stories, and, it must be said, sometimes the facts as well, for the sake of the larger instructive narrative. After all, the fact that the liberation of Auschwitz has become the representative commemorative event, just like the fact that Auschwitz itself has become the preeminent symbol of the Nazis' war against the Jews, already raises questions about the way we learn from the past. After all, 2 million of the 6 million Jews murdered by the German fascists and their local accomplices did not perish in camps like Auschwitz, but were annihilated by mobile death squads. 5 of the 6 people I wrote my book about were shot in that way. As for Auschwitz, not every camp was like Auschwitz. Some, like Belzec, where my great-aunt Esther perished, functioned purely as death camps. There were no work camps that were part of them. There were no barracks, no slave labor details, because when you got off the train, you went straight to the gas chambers. One reason that Auschwitz has dominated our already imperfect memories of the Holocaust is that you could theoretically survive Auschwitz, unlike those other places. And hence, there were memories of it, and therefore narratives about it. Narratives of a part of the Holocaust experience that have, over time, already come to stand for the whole. But as time passes and the individual stories fade away, we need a symbol of the Holocaust, and so Auschwitz has become that symbol, a symbol that is, of course, meant to help us learn about the past. And here, finally, I can start imagining a possible answer to my question. I've spoken thus far about the tension between lived memory and the way memory becomes a story, an educational story, it is hoped, although, as I hope to have shown, those memories and those stories are already inevitably problematic. So what happens when the living connection to a historical event finally dies? When people like me, to whom Lorca Jaeger actually meant something more than a statistic, have all died away, and all that is left are the stories, the symbols. I want to end tonight by making a provocative suggestion which we can expound upon perhaps in the conversation that I'll be having after I finish. And what I want to say is that maybe we learn from an event in the past only so long as the memory of that past, however flawed, is still alive in somebody's mind, still personal for someone. But when that thread snaps, when the event becomes streamlined, narrativized, symbolic, abstract, it becomes that much harder to internalize and therefore that much harder to learn from. The European order established after the Napoleonic Wars lasted, with occasional exceptions, 85 years, which is to say the lifetime of a human being. The world order established after the end of World War II, designed to prevent the rise of global fascism, has already turned out to be as long-lived as the span of a single human life. If you don't believe me, take a look at the newspapers. Right-wing demagogues rising to power in Western democracies in Europe, white supremacist parties gaining electoral power in parliaments, fat cat billionaires kissing the ring to would-be autocrats, our own federal government being dismantled even as we speak this evening, exactly in the way that Hitler dismantled the Weimar Republic. I could go on. But being a nice Jewish boy, I'll give the last word of this talk to my mother, Marlene Jaeger Mendelsohn, Uncle Shmuel's last remaining niece. Mother was born in 1931 and is now at the end of her long life. While watching the evening news together last fall, she leaned over to me and said, "It looks like I was born in the 1930s and I'm going to die in the 1930s. Can we learn from the past?" There's your answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. As we get settled for our conversation, I'd actually like to ask everyone to just take a moment and reflect on the last 30 or 40 minutes. Because there's something I think very special, Daniel, not only about the book, but about your remarks, which is at the same time, it is deeply personal to you, and yet there are themes that are universal to each of us as we think about our personal stories, and then we think about collective memory. So I just would ask everyone just to take a moment to pause before we begin our conversation. Daniel, towards the end of your remarks, you invited further conversation, and it actually takes me in a direction that I had thought of going in a very different way, which is that you began your academic career as a classicist. We heard from Saskia that in April, your translation of Homer's Odyssey will be coming out with the University of Chicago Press. Over the past 15 years, you've been focused on history of a very different kind. How do you connect those two pieces of your academic, professional journey and your personal story, and what do they tell you? How do they inform one another?
I thought he was going to be lobbing me softballs. I think what I've always been interested in is narrative, storytelling. As I mentioned, I had a very charismatic grandfather who, because his education was interrupted by World War I, never even went to high school. He never got that far, but was a very smart guy and a wonderful storyteller, and I was entranced as a kid by his stories about this charming little shtetl, and he came in the 1920s, so it was before the horrors of the war, and he had very nice memories of this rural small town that he grew up in, which I'm sure is like any rural small town once you drive half an hour outside of Columbia, And I think that's always been my interest, and that's the connection, because as a classic scholar, I'm also very interested in, how the stories we tell reveal who we are, and Homer, of course, is the greatest storyteller of them all. And, Homer has a famous way of telling a story where he'll start out by talking about, say, X. But as he keeps going, he realizes he has to stop and talk about Y and tell you the story of Y. And then while he's talking about Y, he thinks, well, actually, to understand Y, you really need to know what happened about Z. And so then he'll tell you about Z, but then eventually comes back to Y, and eventually get back to X. And that technique is called ring composition. But that's how my grandfather told. I thought my grandfather invented that until I went to grad school and realized that Homer was doing it 3,000 years before. So I think what's interesting to me is narrative. And as I very briefly sketched tonight, when I got into the Holocaust business, researching this book about my relatives, which, as I keep pointing out, I'm not an expert on the Holocaust. I'm not like Saskia. I'm not like the people I've been hanging out with for the past day. I just knew these family stories. But what became immediately interesting to me was that even people who were trying to tell the truth are always altering, not even consciously. So, and what I mean by that is they told me what they thought was important when I interviewed people, but maybe something that they left out was what I was interested in. You see, so there's always that problem. And then when you write the book, which I did, I couldn't put everything that I had researched in my book. It would have been unreadable, right? I'm sure some people think it's already unreadable. So you're always shaping the story. Even if everything in it is true, the fact that you've left things out means it's not the whole story. And that became my obsession. So I think in every part of my intellectual and literary life, what I'm interested in is the relationship of the stories you tell about real things, because I'm not a fiction writer, I'm not a novelist, but the relationship of what, as I say, what happened to the story of what happened, and they're never equal. And that is inevitable, but we should always remember that when you pick up a history. My friend John, who's here from Charleston, a dear friend of mine, is a great history buff, but even the fattest history books aren't telling you the whole story because you can't, right? It would just be a mass of notes, and nobody wants a mass of notes. You want a good story, right? So I think that's the connecting thread.
Imagine everyone can understand the position I'm in. There are about 42 threads I want to pull on out of that. One thing I'd been reflecting on even before the talk was the title of the talk. And your remarks just now harken back to this. The choice of the word "the past" rather than "our past," because each of us, frames individually but collectively too. What is the Holocaust to someone who's Jewish, an American Jew, an Israeli Jew, a European Jew, to a non-Jew? So that single word, what does it tell us?
Well, I'll tell you a story. Because it's about perspective, which is so interesting. So, I was born in 1960. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, my childhood and adolescence. I was surrounded by Holocaust survivors. There were a lot of them around. If you grew up in a Jewish suburb of New York, which I did, I knew all the old people I hung out with for Pesach or not even religious holiday. They had tattoos. It was my grandfather's last wife had been in Auschwitz. It seemed natural in a funny, if that doesn't sound too strange. But then when I was in Ukraine, interviewing people in the family town. I was talking to an old Ukrainian woman who lived in a house on the street my uncle had lived in, and she said, after the war, she said, I remember them taking the Jews out of the house and, all. She said, after the war, we had a different kind of purge. She said, because in Stalin, they came and anyone on the street whose house was made of tin was deported to Siberia as opposed to thatch, because tin meant you were bourgeois, you were counter-revolutionary. She said, we had our own problems. I'll never forget that. She looked at me. She said, we had our own problem. And that was a perspectival moment. I'm interested in my Bolokov because of what happened to my family, but horrors continued to happen in Bolokov that I honestly neither knew nor cared about until that day I spoke to her. So when I think about it, in addition to all the other problems I'm, trying to sketch here tonight, there's a problem, again, of who's telling the story, what you're interested in. A Ukrainian, and, as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, the Ukrainians had their own genocide, right? In the 30s, the forced starvation, 7 million Ukrainians died. And very often when I went there, and, as I'm sure you're aware, there's been a sort of in the past maybe 30 years, a kind of explosion of American Jews descended from Eastern European Jews who go back to the old country and they have tours and they see the shtetl where grandpa was born, whatever. And these people would say, when I was interviewing these Ukrainian neighbors of my, uncle and aunt and cousins, they didn't want to hear about the Jewish Holocaust. They said, why is no one writing a book about our Holocaust, right? So that's about perspective, too. So, history. What is history? Depends who you're talking to.
You're talking to someone whose grandfather emigrated, left Ukraine in 1918, went to France, came to the United States, and a corner of my office is dedicated to him because he died right before I was born. And to take it to the present moment, he was an original employee of the U.S. Agency for International Development in 1961. So, as events happen, it's very, as you speak, it's
Hope he's not looking for a job now.
No. I want to explore just a little bit more this connection between history and classics, and I want to do it. Not everyone may have read The Lost yet. You will, I hope, if you haven't, soon. But towards the end of the book, I want to read a quote from the book and get your thoughts on the context of it. When you find yourself in Lviv, in Ukraine, and you're having a conversation with a man named Alex, a historian, and you write this: because he is a historian by training, as I am a classicist, he tries to see things in their complexity and is leery of generalizations, just as I like to see things through the lens of Greek tragedy, which teaches us, among other things, that real tragedy is never a straightforward confrontation between good and evil, but rather, much more exquisitely and much more agonizingly, a conflict between two irreconcilable views of the world. That seems to be even more true today, don't you think? And I guess I want to ask, how has your deep knowledge of classic literature shaped the lens through which you look at the world today? It's so... I travel to places and give these talks, and I always feel like a fraud because the only subject I am actually trained in is Greek tragedy, which I never give lectures about. I talk about the Holocaust, I talk about modern Greek poetry, I talk about Homer. I'm not a Homerist, I seem to back into these things by accident. The only thing I actually know about is Greek tragedy. And the reason I like Greek tragedy as a genre, so much of Greek tragedy is about people who think they can not suffer the consequences of their actions, who try to run away. There's an oracle when they were born that they would do a certain thing, and they think they can outsmart fate and somehow not do the thing, and they end up, even as they try to escape from their fate, they run right into the thing they were trying not to do, right? And I think that's a great vision of the world, because
it's true. It's like physics. Every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. We may try to get away with things, but somehow it always comes back and bites you in the butt. And that is how I understand history, too. Everything that we do will come back to us. Maybe not in our own lifetime, maybe it will be visited upon our children, and we're seeing that right now, all throughout the world. Let's not even talk about what's going on politically. Let's talk about the climate. For 150 years, we thought we could pump this stuff into the atmosphere and somehow get away with it. And you know what? We didn't, whether we admit it or not, right? So that's my vision of the world, and it's bleak, but I find comforting. Well, that's what I like about the Greeks. They're not sentimental about death. It's going to happen, so why try to run? But I do think it has affected me greatly in my Holocaust researches, that one has to be open-eyed about what this actually means and not try to romanticize it, not try to sentimentalize it, to see it for what it was. And since we're on the subject of learning from the past, to understand that it is in some ways unique, but in other ways not unique. So it's the reality principle that always attracted me to classical literature, and which I think came in handy when I was studying the Holocaust. Also, there's only one reviewer of my book who was also a classicist, actually, Gary Wills, the journalist, who said, it's an Odyssey. It's actually an Odyssey story, right? It's about this mad quest all over the place, trying to get this one thing. I always said the real title of my book should be Moby Dick,
And you managed to somehow infuse Greek tragedy into that answer, so you've got, it may not have been the whole lecture, you found its place.
Finally, that expensive grad school education has proved useful.
I do want to remind folks that you have cards in front of you. If you have questions, please raise your hand or pass them down to the end of the aisle. Our student ambassadors will collect them for us here. I do also want to note that this happens almost every year, but I think we have a quorum of our history department faculty here. We could hold a departmental meeting, and I just want to point out to the president that we don't need to rewrite our tenure standards in history in light of the earlier remarks about memory and context. I'd actually like to know a little bit more about your personal story, about what framed you as you were evolving through your teenage years before you went to college. What books inspired you? What ideas inspired you? You've talked about some of the people who were in your community. What were the things that motivated you when you were an adolescent going into college, for our students who are here tonight to think about, and others?
Well, I was a not a normal child. As I said, I got very early on in my life, and this sometimes happens, a great taste of storytelling. I was a reader from an early age because I had been brought up on wonderful, dramatic, dramas, family dramas, and I sought that out in books. It made me want to read. That's what attracted me to Greek mythology. I always like to say, for those of you here who grew up in a certain kind of Jewish family, I always used to joke that I really learned about Greek mythology from my family history because all of my older relatives, like my grandfather's brothers and sisters, they were like Greek gods. Each one had one quality, like Aunt Sylvia, goddess of bitterness, And so when I actually read about the real Greek gods, I thought, I know exactly what that's like. Everyone has one quality, and that's what they're in charge of.
Whatever it may be, whether it be a quality or not.
Right, exactly. Uncle Julius, the Zhlub, So, but it did give me, all kidding aside, I think, being exposed to great narratives as a young child made me want to seek them out elsewhere. And so I was an avid reader from a very early. Also, I grew up in a small house with 4 siblings, so all I ever wanted in life was peace and quiet so I could read. which remains the only thing I want in life. And so I was attracted to myth because it is, I mean, to connect the dots, all kidding aside, to what I was talking about before, you know, what are myths except abstractions that help us think about reality, right? A myth is a symbolic story. And I felt I had been raised on that, and I think that had a lot to do with why I was attracted, you know, to mythology and ultimately the Greek. I read everything, you know. I read things I didn't understand, which I highly recommend to young. No, seriously. I mean, we all start as reading things we didn't understand. So I remember reading my father, who was wonderful, and about whom I wrote this book. An Odyssey, a father and a son in an epic about how my father, at the age of 82, decided to be a student in my freshman Odyssey seminar. That was funny. And he would give me books to read, and I remember he gave me a book because he knew I was interested in, you know, Greece already, and he gave me a novel about Alexander the Great. And I was like 11, and there's a passage I still remember where he said, I lay with her, and then she was with child. And I remember thinking, how did that happen? He just lay with her? You know. But I think, all kidding aside, reading above your level is the best thing you can do because it stretches your mind. And eventually, you know, when I was in my 40s, I understood what he meant, you know.
Hard transition to the question I have at the top of the pile. But it's a version of something, if I'd had a little more time, I want to turn to the questions from the audience. I might have asked, maybe I'll add a little piece of it. But the question is, will AI perpetuate inaccuracy of history, or can it lead to more precision and accuracy over time? And how do you get it right if you're writing the algorithms? And then I'd ask, sort of in a world of technology advancing the pace it is, what does Homer tell us? What are the lessons there? So let me try to connect those two pieces.
Look, I mean, I'm the son of a mathematician and the brother of a physicist. I'm a
You should be a dean of arts and sciences.
I'm a STEM-friendly humanist, you know. And so my father actually, already back in the 70s and 80s, was working on very early kinds of artificial intelligence. That was his thing. I mean, much more primitive than anything you can even get on your iPhone in 1 minute, but it was the beginning. And, you know, I think of these things, I think it's important to keep your head screwed on when thinking about these technological advances. You know, they always are scary at first, but they are ultimately just tools. And, you know, like any kind of tool, it can be used for good or for nefarious purposes. Look, again, as a classicist, I always try to take the long view. You know, when the printing press was invented, people thought it was the end of the world. You know, well, how do you control this? It can print anything. It can print things that are true. It can print things that are not true. When writing was invented, people thought it was the end of the world. Let's not forget, right? You know, you think Homer liked that? No. You know, he put him out of business, right? So I'm trying to be sanguine about it. I always tell my students, you know, remember, if you write your papers with AI, I can write my recommendations with AI. So I'm trying to be, you know, level-headed about it. Look, we all know that it's imperfect in terms of ostensibly one of the things we're interested in tonight, which is the truth, learning. How do you learn, right? So AI is just a mechanism, and it processes what you give it. So my favorite example of why I'm not bothered by AI anymore is for obvious reasons, when I log on to Facebook or, you know, whatever, I'm always getting these visual reconstructions of the ancient world. You know, it's like Rome, 38 BC, or, you know, and then it will say, you know, Egypt, 2600 BC, or Persia, 550, and they all look exactly the same. And they all look like an episode of The White Lotus. They all look like they're taking place in an upscale Mediterranean hotel, and everyone's really buff and has fabulous, and I'm like, you know what? It did not look like that. But that's what AI knows because that's what it's been fed. So, I think it can be an amazing tool. Look, one of the greatest advances in classical scholarship is happening right now because of AI. I don't know if anybody here has read about this, but I'm actually writing an article about it right now for The New Yorker, which is these scrolls that were carbonized during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Pompeii and Herculaneum, which just look like charcoal, they look like little lumps of coal, can now be read partly through the help of AI. So ancient texts that were lost, completely lost for 2,000 years, we're now able to read. So, it's like anything else. It can do good things, it can do bad things. So I'm not too worried yet. I'm sure I'll be eating my words when my robot locks me in the bathroom,
It's okay. During the brief period I owned a Tesla,
Yeah,
it took me 6 months to reliably be able to figure out how to open the door. Mm-hmm. So you're in good company. I'll read this next question. Can you say a few words about memory as a receptacle for guilt? Not necessarily Jewish guilt, guilt in general. My mother would, as I say, that's my love language. At some point, the guilty person feels the need to unload, to release that memory, or do they? What are your thoughts?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that the answer is embedded in what I was talking about before about everything coming back. That we know. I don't know. Many people here probably were in public schools, as I was, where you had to read that amazing Edgar Allan Poe story, The Telltale Heart, and that everything you do, even if you're not caught by someone else, you will be caught by your own guilty conscience. Look, on a more personal note, my grandfather, whom I talked about today, like many American Jews, felt guilty for not having been able to help his brother, and it obviously ate away at him his entire life in ways none of us ever dreamed of, and that was a very common thing, and in fact there was nothing these people could do. You couldn't, in 1939, you couldn't get your relatives out of Poland, partly for practical reasons, partly because nobody wanted them, including the U.S., and that guilt is a phenomenon that we know about, right? So I think memory, real memory, is an organic function, right? We talk about memory a lot nowadays. You say, oh, I have the iPhone 16. It has more memory than your iPhone 11 or, whatever. But that's not memory. That's just storage. And I think it's important to distinguish between memory and storage. You now have 63,000 photos on your phone, whereas memory is when I was a kid growing up, you had to take the film to the developer and then you had to choose the ones you thought were good. That's memory. 63,000 phones on your phone is storage. Let's just keep that in mind. And guilt is an important part of memory, right? There is no guilt without memory, right? And I had a very interesting conversation at lunch today with some of the wonderful students here, and we were talking about countries who have acknowledged, this is about guilt and memory, countries like Germany, who confronted their guilty consciences about what happened in the war, have been much more successful, actually, than countries who can't acknowledge their guilt. Like Ukraine. In Ukraine, they still can only see that they were victims, that they were never perpetrators, which they certainly were. So it's very interesting, this connection between memory and guilt, and it always comes out. Even if sometimes in a deformed way, a guilty memory that has no outlet will manifest itself in dark ways, right?
Well, indeed, the connection between memory and feelings more broadly,
Yeah.
and how that then influences a memory or shifts a memory or
Yeah.
a series of them.
Yeah.
So you just mentioned Germany, and this next question references Germany. So can the U.S., this must be something you're thinking about in the present moment, learn from the horrors of the German Nazi regime to prevent the same here? And there's a kind of continuation of that question, but I'll stop there.
Well, it seems
The,
like...
the writer says they're concerned that we're on that path now without...
Yeah, well, I think it's very clear we're on that path now. I think if you don't think that, you're not looking at the newspapers or you're watching Fox News, or as I call it, Pravda. It's very clearly happening, right? What the Germans called, there's a term in German for the way that Hitler took over the government and purged possible opponents in the civil service, is called Gleichschaltung, right? Getting everyone on the same circuit. That's actually happening right now. That is literally happening right now. So you can kid yourself and pretend that we're somehow nicer than the Germans, but you know what? The Germans thought they were nice too. So I don't think it's about will it happen. It is actually happening. It is actually happening. We are watching from the exact same playbook every move that's being made for the past 3 weeks. So I'm sorry, that's what's happening. So I don't think we have learned, as my poor mother grimly, predicted. It's the 19th, and not just in this country, it's happening all over. That's why I think it's so interesting. I think what is happening in the world, and this was this point I was speculating about, I think is happening because the memory of the horrors of the Second World War have essentially passed from living memory, right? They've only become symbolic at this point. There's very few people alive today who actually remember what it was like to live in a world in which fascism had taken over, a number of countries, and that's why I think this is happening, not just here, but everywhere. Poland for a while, Hungary. This is, the far-right party is gaining strength in Norway, in Germany, the AfD, favorite of Elon Musk. So why is this happening now? Because no one remembers. No one remembers. You can have somebody giving a Nazi salute as part of an inauguration parade. Do you think that could have happened 20 years ago? There would have been an incredible outrage. And now it's just like, oh, did he or didn't he? Well, I think we all know what a Nazi salute looks like. So I'm sorry, but that's the news. I don't think there's anything to say. The only thing that startles me is how fast it's happening, which took me by surprise. But the warning signs have already been here, for a very long time. So that's unfortunately the answer to the question. It's very important, I think, to remember that, part of the myth of this country, which is, justified to a certain extent because the principles on which it was founded, is that we are exceptional. We are an exception to history. We were, after all, the place to which you ran away from the evil autocracies of Europe, and we have this fantasy of ourselves as the good guys of history, which in certain times we have been, but, we also founded our country on a genocide. Our economy still is bearing the fruits of slavery, right, which was abolished a century and a half ago. And these things we don't like to talk about. I think it's very significant that on our National Mall, there is a Holocaust memorial, a memorial to an event that did not take place in the United States, but in which we like to think that we were the good guys. And there is still no museum of black slavery, which there should be. Not just a museum of black culture, and there is a wonderful museum now in Washington, but a museum specifically devoted to slavery, which is the founding evil of this country. And we can't get there. We still can't admit somehow. So we've got a Holocaust museum, and I have news for you. The Holocaust didn't happen here. But that we like to think about, So there's a certain amount, I think, can we learn from the past? In order to learn, you have to stop being self-deluded. We need to get there.
In that space, what responsibility do we have in this room, do we have collectively, taking the past, thinking about history to shape our presence?
You got to look at what it was and be realistic and be honest, and take the scales off your eyes. And that's why this is an educational institution. So people always say to me, what can we do? What can we do? Well, a lot, unfortunately, we've already failed to do. But the one thing we could do as educators, as teachers, is teach better, educate better, make young people look at the past in a way that is realistic and take away as best we can. And, as I myself said, we are always tripped up by our own unconscious, desires, right? But as best we can, keep teaching. That's the only hope, is to educate a new, generation of people who can look at history, see it for what it was, and to try to look at what's happening with unclouded vision. That's what education is for. So unless we keep doing that, we're in real trouble.